There's a thing they don't tell you about the wilderness. It doesn't care about your plans. You can ride out at dawn with 40 years of range knowledge packed behind your eyes, with calluses on your hands thick enough to stop a splinter, with a rifle you know the weight of better than your own name. You can know every canyon draw and dry creek bed between the Sangre de Cristos and the Cimarron, and the wilderness will still look at you like you're new. I know this because of what happened to Cord Howlet. I know this because I was there, keeping my full ledger like I always do, scratching notes in the margins like notes could somehow hold a thing steady when the world goes sideways. I've been writing things down since I was 11 years old, and my daddy told me memory is a liar. He wasn't wrong, but I'll tell you flat, nothing I wrote in those pages across 40-some years prepared me for what I watched happen between one broken-down cowboy and a 3-month-old mountain lion cub in the canyon country north of Taos in the autumn of 1887. People have asked me since, was it trained? Was it tame? Did he do something to it? No, and that's exactly the question. Cord didn't do anything to it. The autumn Cord Howlet came back to the Mesilla Range was the autumn nobody expected him to come back at all. I should explain what I mean by that, and I will, but not the way most men would explain it, starting at the beginning and working forward, clean and simple. Life doesn't run clean and simple, and neither does grief, and what Cord carried into that high country was grief of the particular kind that doesn't announce itself. It just sits in a man's frame the way bad weather sits in old bone. You feel it in the way he holds his shoulders. You feel it in the silences that last 3 beats too long. I was keeping the supply ledger for the Rays outfit that fall. Augusto Rays ran about 400 head of mixed cattle across a stretch of broken mesa country that started flat, and then crumpled up into canyon walls and ponderosa, and the smell of pine sap and iron-cold creek water. It wasn't a big operation by some standards. It was big enough to need 3 working hands, a cook, and somebody like me to track the numbers and keep the supply chain from going sideways. Augusto had hired me out of Cimarron 2 years previous when his regular bookkeeper rode off to marry a woman in Santa Fe and never came back. I stayed because the work suited me, and because I had nowhere particular to be, and because Augusto's cook, a Jicarilla Apache man named Taos who went by the Spanish name because his given name was something visitors couldn't manage, made a venison stew that I still dream about on cold nights. Cord showed up on a Tuesday in early October. He rode a gray roan mare named Assumption. I learned the name later from Cord himself, who said he'd named her that because riding her anywhere required it. And he came down off the North Ridge Trail in the early afternoon with the light cutting flat and copper through the ponderosa. I was sitting on the supply shed steps with my ledger, doing the math on winter feed costs, and I watched him come down. He was not a small man, that's the first thing. He stood maybe 6'2" in his boots, and he was built the way range work builds a man, not bulky but deep through the chest and long in the arm, the kind of frame that looks ordinary until it's doing something that reveals the engine underneath. He was 43 years old that autumn. I know his age because Augusto told me later, with the particular tone men use when they're explaining why they're cutting someone extra slack. 43. He looked 60, the way some men do when a specific kind of year has found them. His hat was an old black felt, creased low, the brim curled at the edges from years of rain and reshaping. He wore a canvas coat that had started life brown and arrived at something closer to the color of dry creek clay. There was a rifle scabbard on the left side of his saddle and nothing particular on his hip, which I noticed because most men who came into Ray's territory with that kind of quiet about them were carrying something visible. Cord wasn't, or if he was, he'd tucked it somewhere I couldn't see. He stopped Assumption at the edge of the yard and waited. That was the other thing I noticed. He didn't holler, didn't wave, didn't push forward the way men do when they're confident or the way they do when they're desperate. He just stopped and waited, like a man who understood that arriving somewhere was a request, not a right. Augusto came out of the main house, wiped his hands on his pants, and walked across the yard. I watched them talk. I couldn't hear it at that distance, but I could read the shape of it, Augusto asking, Cord answering in short pieces, Augusto nodding. Then Augusto turned and called for Tamas, and that meant Cord was staying for supper at minimum, which meant he was probably staying longer, which meant Augusto had hired him. He had. I learned over supper what any of us were going to learn, which wasn't much. Cord Howlet had worked the Cimarron country, then the Mora Valley, then a stretch of New Mexico territory that ran up toward the Colorado border. He knew cattle, he knew horses, he knew the specific and undervalued skill of reading weather in the high country, which is not the same as reading weather on the plains and is worth more than most ranchers will admit. He'd had his own outfit at one point. He didn't have it anymore. He didn't explain why beyond a single word, fire. Augusto didn't push, which was the right call. Tamas set a plate in front of Cord, and Cord ate with the focused attention of a man who's been skipping meals, which told its own story. I was keeping notes in the margins of my ledger. I do this at supper sometimes, little observations, things I don't want to forget, and I wrote, "New hand, Cord H. quiet, watches the room without appearing to watch it. Something happened to him recently, not ready to say what." That note turned out to be more accurate than most of my notes, which is saying something, because I'm generally right about men. What I didn't write, because I didn't know how to put it into ledger language, was the other thing I noticed about Cord Howlet. The thing I only caught for a moment, right before he looked away. His eyes, when they weren't occupied with watching something specific, had the particular quality of eyes that have gotten used to looking at something that isn't there anymore. I knew that look. My wife had that look for 2 years after our son died of fever when he was 4. It's not sadness exactly. Sadness moves. This look is still. It's the look of an absence that has become so familiar it's taken on the shape of a presence. I closed my ledger and said nothing, which was the most useful thing I could contribute at that moment. Cord worked the north pasture rotation for the first 3 weeks. Augusto put him on the far end deliberately, I think, giving him space, giving the other hands time to get used to him at a distance before they had to get used to him close. The other hands were 2 brothers named Furman and Cato Vidal, Nuevo Mexicanos from the Mora Valley, whose family had ranched that country before Texas Longhorns were a concept. They were good men, competent in the particular way that men are competent when they've been doing something since childhood, without having to think much about it. They were also loud in the way comfortable men are loud, joking across distances, calling insults at each other that were affectionate and elaborate and occasionally bilingual. The kind of volume that comes from feeling at home in a place. Cord was the opposite of that. He wasn't unfriendly, he'd answer if you spoke to him, and he answered straight and without aggression. But he operated in a kind of personal silence that the Vidal brothers found puzzling and I found recognizable. Some men get quiet when they're thinking. Some men get quiet when they're done. Cord was quiet in a way that suggested he'd run out of things he wanted to say for a while, and was waiting to see if anything new accumulated. I ate supper with him alone on the 4th night, because the Vidal brothers had ridden to a neighbor's place, and Augusto had gone to bed early with a headache. It was just Cord and me, and Tamas's leftover stew, and the sound of the wind working at the eaves. I don't press men. It's not my nature, and I've learned it's bad for the work. Men who feel pressed give you less than men who feel left alone. So I ate, and I kept my ledger open on the table beside my plate, and I wrote a few things, and I let the silence be what it was. After a while, Cord said, "What are you always writing in that thing?" I told him, supply numbers sometimes. Observations sometimes, things I wanted to remember. He looked at the ledger with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Not contempt, not curiosity exactly, something in between, like he was deciding how he felt about the idea of someone writing things down. "Does it help?" he asked. I said I thought it did. I said sometimes writing a thing made it smaller, or at least made it something you could look at from outside yourself. He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I thought the conversation was done. Then he said, "I had a boy." I kept my pen still. I didn't look up from the ledger. 8 years old, Cord said. His name was William, but he didn't like William, wanted to be called Dutch, no idea where he got that, just decided one day, Dutch. A pause. He liked horses, he'd have been good with them, he was already good with them. The had and was were doing the work there, I let them do it. Fire, Cord said, and that was the whole explanation he was going to give, and I understood that it contained everything. The outfit, the house, the boy named Dutch, the wife who may or may not have survived, the 43-year-old man sitting across from me with eyes that looked at something absent. One word for the whole catastrophe. I said, "I'm sorry." Cord nodded once, clean and finished, the way you nod when someone says the right small thing. Then he finished his stew and rinsed his bowl and went to the bunkhouse. I sat there for a while, then I wrote in my ledger he lost a son. Fire. No further details needed, don't ask. Then I turned to a clean page and did the feed numbers, because sometimes the only thing to do is go back to the numbers. It was Taos who first mentioned the tracks. This was the second week of October, after the first real cold had come down off the Sangre de Cristos and put a skin of frost on the water trough in the mornings. Taos had been up before light. He was always up before light, which I respected and could not replicate, and he'd gone to check on the chickens, and he'd found tracks in the soft mud near the fence line. He came and found me at my breakfast and described them. Large cat, significant size, maybe 4 or 5 inches across at the pad. Mountain lion country up in those canyon walls was not unusual. They'd had depredations in previous years, mostly chickens and once a half-grown calf. Taos wasn't alarmed exactly, but he thought someone should know. I told Augusto. Augusto told the Vidal brothers to keep an eye on the stock when they were working the north end. And then Augusto, with the rancher's particular gift for understatement, said he supposed he'd better let Cord know, since Cord was working that country. What nobody said, but what I registered in my ledger that evening, was that a mountain lion working the north fence line was working the same canyon country Cord Howlet rode alone every morning in the dark, before the other hands were up. Cord had that habit, early writing. He'd told me when I asked that he'd always been that way, like the country before the light fully committed to it, like the quiet. I thought about that. A man riding alone in the dark in mountain lion country, in the canyon draws where a cat could sit on a ledge above you and you'd never know. I didn't say any of this. I wrote it in the ledger and told myself I was probably manufacturing drama, which is a failing I have sometimes when the ledger work gets slow. As it turned out, I wasn't manufacturing anything. I was just several days early. It was Cord who found the cub. He found it on a Thursday, in the second week of October, in a dry wash about a mile north of the main canyon, tucked into a hollow under a root mass where a big ponderosa had toppled sideways across the bank. He told me about it that evening. He told me before he told Augusto, which I noted without saying anything about. He'd been riding the wash, checking for cattle that sometimes pushed up into that country chasing the last of the grama grass before the cold finished it. He'd heard something. Not a big sound. A small sound, the kind that only carries when everything else is quiet. A sound between a bird call and something he didn't have a word for. He'd stopped Assumption and listened. Then he'd dismounted and gone into the wash on foot. The cub was maybe 3 months old. That was his estimate. He said he'd seen mountain lions before, not often, and he was going off proportion and size and the particular look of young animals that haven't grown into their feet yet. It was wedged deep into the root hollow, hissing at him when he got close. There was dried blood on its left shoulder, not fresh, crusted over, a wound that had happened some days ago and was either healing or not. It was thin in the way animals get thin when they haven't eaten in longer than they should go without eating. He'd stood there in the wash looking at it. "What did you do?" I asked him. He scratched the back of his neck. That was a gesture I'd come to recognize in Cord. He did it when he was working up to saying something he thought might sound foolish. "Backed off," he said. "Went back to the horse, sat on a rock for a while." I waited. "Then I went back down into the wash," he said. "I had some jerked beef in my coat pocket. I broke off a piece and put it on the ground about 4 feet from the hollow. Then I went back up." I asked him why. He was quiet for a beat. "Didn't see that I had a better choice," he said. "It was hurt and hungry and alone, seemed like somebody ought to do something." What I didn't understand then, what none of us understood, not yet, was that Cord had been going back. Every morning in the dark before the other hands were up, before the light committed to the sky. He'd been riding out to that wash and going down into it on foot, and he'd been sitting near the root hollow, and he'd been leaving pieces of jerked beef or dried meat on the ground and then backing off. He didn't tell anyone about this. Not Augusto. Not Taos, who probably would have understood. Not the Vidal brothers, who definitely would not have. Not me, though I was the one he'd told about finding the cub in the first place. I found out because I couldn't sleep. This was about 10 days after he'd told me about finding the cub. I had a bad night, the kind that comes when the numbers in my ledger have stopped making sense, because the problem underneath them is not a numbers problem, and the ledger is just a tool, and no tool solves the thing I'm actually awake at 3 in the morning thinking about. The thing I was actually thinking about was what Cord had told me about the boy called Dutch. I don't know why it chose that particular night to sit on my chest. It just did. I got up. I put on my coat and went outside because sometimes cold air does what whiskey does, cheaper and without the next morning. The yard was completely dark except for the stars, which in that high country at that altitude were not the soft stars of lower elevation. They were aggressive, frank, overwhelming, the kind of stars that make you feel that your understanding of scale is fundamentally miscalibrated. I stood there for a while, then I heard hooves. Assumption coming down from the north. I almost went back inside. It was Cord's habit and it was his business. But something kept me there. Call it the ledger habit. Call it the fact that it was 4 in the morning and a man was riding back from the canyon country in the dark and I wanted to know why or wanted to verify what I suspected. I stood in the shadow of the supply shed. Cord came into the yard and he had something in front of him on the saddle. I didn't understand what I was looking at for a moment. The dark was still mostly absolute. Then he passed near the window of the main house where a low light burned. Augusto sometimes left one burning against the night, and I saw. The mountain lion cub was lying across his saddle fender on the far side of his leg, draped across it like a very small, spotted thing that had decided it was exactly where it wanted to be. Its eyes caught the light for a moment, that particular flat green Ishin that night animals carry. It was awake. It was not struggling. It was lying there with a stillness that was not the stillness of unconsciousness, but the stillness of a creature that had made a decision about where it was safe. Cord's left hand was resting on its back. He rode to the corral, dismounted slowly, careful, the way you move when you're carrying something that trusts you, and then he stood for a moment in the dark with the cub in both hands. It made a sound I couldn't name at that distance. Then he went to the small shed at the east side of the corral, the one they used for tack overflow, and he went inside, and after a few minutes he came out without the cub, and he brought Assumption in and unsaddled her and turned her out, and then he stood in the yard for a moment looking at nothing. I should have gone back to bed. Instead, I stepped out of the shadow of the supply shed. Cord went absolutely still, the way men go still when they realize they've been seen doing something private. I wasn't following you, I said, which was mostly true. Couldn't sleep. He looked at me. I couldn't read his face at that distance and in that dark. How long has that been going on? I asked. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Since about a week after I found her, he said. Her, he'd figured out the sex then, or decided. I made a note of that pronoun internally. People assign gender to things they've started to feel about. She's not dangerous, I asked, because I genuinely wanted to know, not because I was suggesting he stop. She's 3 months old and she's got a wound on her shoulder that's healing up, Cord said. At the moment, she's about as dangerous as a house cat with an attitude. At the moment, I said. At the moment, he agreed. I asked him what he was planning to do. He scratched the back of his neck. Nothing particular, he said. She comes when she wants. She leaves when she wants. He stopped, started again. She was hurt and she was alone and she started to follow me. I can't explain more than that. I thought about saying something more. I thought about the ledger entry I was going to write in the morning. I thought about the boy named Dutch and the fire and the particular look of a man who's gotten used to looking at something that isn't there. All right, I said. And I went back to bed. And I wrote nothing in my ledger that night because there are things that don't fit in a ledger, and what I'd seen was one of them. And I knew better than to try to make it fit by putting words on it before it was finished being what it was. Cord named her December, though it was still October. He told me the name about a week after the night I'd seen him ride in with her. He said it like he'd thought about it, which I believed. When I asked him why December, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, because that's when things are hardest and quietest and you can't see much ahead of you, seemed fitting. I said nothing, I wrote it down. December, in those first weeks after she'd started coming in with Cord at night, was not a particularly cooperative creature in the way that word is usually meant. She didn't cuddle. She didn't play the way a kitten plays. She ate what was offered. Cord was bringing her scraps, small pieces of meat, enough to supplement whatever she was hunting in the wash country, which she apparently was still doing on her own during the days. And she tolerated touch with a kind of imperious patience, as though she'd decided contact was acceptable but the terms were hers and hers alone. She didn't purr. Mountain lions don't, precisely. They chirp, they whistle, they make sounds that don't map cleanly onto any domestic animal equivalent. December made a sound that was somewhere between a bird and a complaint, and she made it specifically when Cord moved away from her before she was ready for him to move away. Taos knew within 2 days of the night I'd seen Cord ride in. Taos noticed everything on that ranch. He was simply discriminating about what he reacted to. He watched Cord with December for a while from a distance. The tack shed had been quietly understood as December's space, though she also spent time near the corral, watching Assumption with an expression of extreme critical assessment, and then Taos came and found me in the supply shed. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "That cat has chosen him," Taos said. He said it the way a man states a fact that has been verified, flat, complete, without drama. I asked him what he meant by chosen. Taos considered this. He was not a man who used words casually, and he didn't use them casually now. "Mountain lions don't follow people," he said. "Not like that, not like she does. She goes with him when he rides. She comes back when he comes back. That's not hunger, that's not habit, that's something else." I asked what he thought the something else was. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She lost her mother, he lost something. They found each other." He paused. "It's not complicated, it's just hard to explain to people who want it to be complicated." I wrote that down verbatim in my ledger. I still have it. It's not complicated. It's just hard to explain to people who want it to be complicated. It is one of the more useful things I've been told in my life. The Vittle brothers found out on a Saturday when Furman went into the tack shed for a bridle he thought he'd left there, and came back out at something close to a dead run, which was notable because Furman Vittle was not a man who moved quickly under ordinary circumstances. The conversation that followed involved volume, a significant amount of Spanish, and Augusto coming out of the house with his coffee to find out what was happening. Cord stood in the middle of all of it with December at his feet. She'd followed him out when she heard the noise, apparently out of curiosity, and watched the Vittle brothers react with an expression I can only describe as mildly tired. Augusto looked at December. December looked at Augusto with the particular golden-eyed assessment of a mountain lion evaluating something and finding it interesting but not urgent. Augusto looked at Cord. "How long?" Augusto said. Cord told him. Augusto was quiet for a moment. He was a deliberate man, Augusto. He didn't react to things immediately. He gave them space. He let himself feel the full shape of something before he decided how he felt about it. "She been into the chickens?" he asked. Cord said no. "Into the cattle?" "No." Augusto looked at December for another long moment. December switched her tail once and looked away, toward the north, toward the canyon country. "All right," Augusto said. He went back inside with his coffee. Cato Vittle stared after him, and then stared at Cord, and then at December, and said something in Spanish that I didn't catch, but that made Furman laugh despite himself. Then they went back to work, with the particular attitude of men who have decided something is the boss's problem, and therefore not theirs. I wrote in my ledger, "Augusto is a better man than I sometimes give him credit for." This was not a new conclusion, but it needed to be written down again. December grew. This is a simple sentence for a thing that was not simple to watch. She was 3 months when Cord found her, and she grew the way young animals grow in that high-calorie, hard-country way, not slowly and steadily but in visible lurches, as though the growing happened overnight, and you noticed it when you looked at her in the morning. By the end of October, she was noticeably larger. By mid-November, she was large enough that Cato Vittle, who'd made his peace with her existence while maintaining a personal policy of staying at least 12 feet away, said once at supper that he reckoned she'd be full-sized by spring. She was also faster and quieter, and she had the particular quality of young predators where the skills are coming online in the eyes before they're coming online in the body. She'd watch Assumption in the corral with a focus that had sharpened from assessment to something more calculated, and Cord would see her watching and he'd go and sit near her, and she'd register his presence and shift, and the focus would soften. That specifically was what got to me. Not the fact that she followed him, not the fact that she came back when he came back. What got to me was that she let him redirect her. She was a wild animal with instincts that were clicking into place, and this man's proximity changed what she was doing with those instincts. Not because he commanded her. He never commanded her. not because he'd trained her. He hadn't. He just sat near her, and something in his presence carried information she received and acted on. I tried to write this in my ledger and couldn't get it right. I wrote several versions. None of them said the thing I meant. The closest I got was, she's calmer when he's there, not tame, calmer. There's a difference. What I didn't write because I wasn't ready to write it was the other part, the mirror part. Cord was calmer when she was there too. The thing I've turned over in my mind most, in the years since that autumn on the Rays Range, is the afternoon I found Cord sitting against the north wall of the corral with December in his lap. Not beside him, in his lap, or as much of her as fit in a human lap, which by late November was a different calculation than it would have been in October. She was maybe 40 pounds by then, big enough that the arrangement was logistically involved. She was sprawled across him, front legs hanging off one side, back legs off the other, her head on his chest, turned sideways, eyes half closed. He had one hand resting on her side, rising and falling with her breathing. He was looking at the mountains to the north. I stopped when I saw them. I had my ledger, I had a pencil, I did not open the ledger, I just stood there. After a while, Cord said, without looking at me, "You're doing that thing where you stand and look without saying anything." I said I was. "You could come sit down." I went and sat against the wall about 6 feet from him. December opened one eye, assessed me, closed it again. I took this as acceptance. We were quiet for a while. The afternoon light was doing the thing it does in high country in November. Not warm exactly, but golden in a way that's almost too direct. That makes everything look specifically lit, as though something is attending to it. Cord said she won't stay. I looked at him. "When she's grown out," he said, "when she's full, she'll go into the canyon country and she won't come back." He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the mountains. "That's what happens, I know that." I said I supposed that was so. "I'm trying to make sure I know it now," he said, "before it happens." "So it doesn't," he stopped, started differently. "Dutch used to do this thing, when he was little, 4, maybe 5, if he fell down and hurt himself, he'd hold very still for a second before he cried, like he was taking stock, like he was deciding how bad it actually was." A pause. "I think about that a lot." December's breathing shifted slightly under his hand, then steadied. "I think about how I didn't know," Cord said. "When I left that morning, I didn't know it was the last time. If I'd known it was the last time, I'd have." He stopped, looked down at December. His hand moved slowly across her side. "I'd have done something different. I would have held on longer, or said something, or just looked at him a while longer." I had nothing to say to this. There is nothing to say to this, and I've learned not to try to put something in a space that should be empty. We sat for a while. Then Cord said, and his voice was different now, lower, more careful. "She chose me. She had every reason not to. She was hurt and hungry, and the instinct would have been to hide and wait. But she let me come close. She followed me." He paused. "I don't know what to do with that." I said carefully, "Maybe you don't have to do anything with it. Maybe it's enough that it happened." He was quiet for a long time. December made the sound she made, the bird complaint sound, when his breathing changed. His breathing changed because his chest was moving differently, which I recognized even from 6 feet away in the sideways November light. He put his face down against the top of her head. His whole frame, which had been careful and contained and held in all autumn, went through something. Not a collapse, a release. The difference between a dam breaking and a valve opening. This was the valve, careful, private, controlled to the extent it could be controlled. December didn't move. She lay there and let him hold on to her, and she didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't do anything except stay. I opened my ledger. I did not write anything. I just let the page be open. After a while it passed. Cord straightened, wiped his face with his sleeve, a single clean motion, matter of fact, looked at the mountains again. "Sorry," he said. I said, "Don't." He looked at me. "Don't say sorry for that," I said. That had somewhere it needed to go. He was quiet. December switched her tail twice slowly and then settled further into him. "She found me because she was hurt," Cord said after a while. "I found her because I was hurt. I thought I was helping her." He stopped. "I don't think that was all of it." I didn't say anything. I think she was helping me too. I closed my ledger, not because I had what I needed, because some things you should not try to get into a ledger. December left in March. She didn't leave dramatically. She didn't leave on a day that had any particular quality. She was there in the morning, and she was not there in the afternoon, and that was the nature of it. Cord came in at supper, and Tamas asked him, with his eyes rather than words, and Cord said she'd gone up into the North Canyon sometime during the midday, and she hadn't come back by nightfall. The Vittles brothers were quiet, which was unusual. Augusto said she did well. Cord said yes. Supper went on. But I watched him. I watched him through the meal, and I watched him push back from the table and go out onto the step for a while before the bunkhouse, and I watched the way he sat on that step, not collapsed, not diminished. Held still. The way you sit when you've been holding something and you've set it down carefully, and you're checking your hands to see how you held up. He looked for her twice in the first week. Rode north into the canyon country in the early morning, as he always had. Came back without her. Did not speak about it. On the third time he came back, and he came to find me in the supply shed. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "She's up there," he said. I waited. "She's doing fine," he said. "Saw her on the rim above the North Wash. She saw me. She stayed there for a while, then she went on." I asked him how she'd looked. Something moved in his face. Not grief exactly, the adjacent thing. "Big," he said. She looked like herself, fully herself." A pause. "She looked the way she was supposed to look." I wrote that down later. She looked the way she was supposed to look. Another sentence I've kept. He went back to his work. What happened next was not immediate. Things that matter rarely are. But over the weeks that followed, March into April, April into the warming of May, I noticed something happening in Cord Howlet that I don't have language for exactly. The ledger language doesn't hold it. The best I can do is describe what I observed. He started talking more. Not much more. He was still a contained man, still quiet, still given to those long silences that had characterized him since October. But where before his silences had the quality of something shut, now they had the quality of something resting. Pausing between things, there's a difference. He made a joke one evening in April. Not a big joke. A small one, dry and sideways, about Cotto Vittles' relationship with a particular fence post that kept refusing to go into the ground correctly. The Vittles brothers laughed. Cord smiled briefly. It was the first time I'd seen him smile. I didn't write it down. I looked at it and let it be. He started asking Tamas about plants. This surprised me. Cord was a practical man in the empirical ranching way, and botanical conversation was not obviously in his wheelhouse. But Tamas knew the canyon country plants the way he knew everything in that landscape, completely, without ceremony, with the particular authority of knowledge that comes from need rather than interest. And Cord would ask him things. What that yellow flower was, what that ground-trailing plant was, whether that was the same sage as the lower country or a different kind. Tamas would answer him, and Cord would listen with the complete attention of a man who's decided this information matters. I think he was learning the canyon country. I think he was learning it because December was in it, and knowing it was a way of staying connected to her without following her. Understanding the country she lived in was a way of being near it without intruding. But I also think it was something else. I think he was finding things to know. After a season of carrying something so heavy there wasn't room for much else, he was finding things to learn and carry instead. Not better, not a replacement. Just, also, other things held at the same time as the grief, so the grief was not the only thing. I may be wrong about this. I'm a bookkeeper. My understanding of human internal states is limited and probably colored by what I want to be true. But I watched him all that spring, and I think I'm right. He stayed through the summer. Augusto offered him a permanent position in late April, formally, meaning Cord's wages would go up, and there'd be a written agreement, and he'd have first claim on a room in the main house come winter. Cord said he'd think about it. He said yes 3 days later, sitting on the corral fence, watching Assumption graze without particular ceremony. Augusto shook his hand. That was that. The last time I saw December was in June. I was up early, genuinely up early, not for any reason that had to do with Cord, but because the June mornings in that country are something you want to be awake for. There's a quality of light about 20 minutes before full sunrise in high desert June that I don't have the right words for except to say, it makes you understand why certain people have always held certain landscapes as sacred. The light does something at that hour in that country. It comes in at an angle that illuminates everything from the side. and things that you've looked at 100 times reveal their structure and their texture, and something that might as well be called their intention. I was at the well, and I looked up toward the north. On the rim of the North Canyon wall, where the Ponderosa break and the rock face begins, there was a shape. It was too far to be certain. The distance was real, a quarter mile, maybe more, but the shape was the right shape. Big and low-slung and still, the way cats are still when they're watching something. Sitting on the rim with the early light catching the tawny length of her. She was looking down at the ranch. I don't know what a mountain lion sees. I don't know what she made of the buildings, the corral, the smoke beginning to rise from Tomaz's cookfire. Whether she registered anything, specifically, in the way I'd like to believe she registered it. But she sat there for a while. A long while, longer than a passing curiosity would have required. Then she turned and went into the Ponderosa and was gone. I wrote in my ledger, she came back to look. Whether she knew it or not, she came back to look. I don't know if that's true, I believe it. I think Cord would have believed it too if I'd told him, but I didn't tell him. Some things you hold on to because if you share them, they become smaller, and I wanted it to be the size it was. What I want to tell you, what this whole ledger full of notes across that autumn and winter and spring is really trying to say, is about what December did to Cord Howlet and what Cord did to December, and why it mattered in the way that things that can't be explained tend to matter most. Cord came into that canyon country carrying something that had almost finished him. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man for drama, but in the quiet inward way that loss finds certain kinds of men. The kind who hold themselves responsible for things they could not have controlled. The kind who can't stop replaying the morning they left without knowing it was the last morning. The kind who have gotten so good at keeping themselves held together that they don't know how to stop and feel the weight, and the weight just accumulates inside the held-togetherness until the structure is doing nothing but supporting the weight. He found a cub that was hurt and alone, and he thought, somebody ought to do something. What he didn't know was that in deciding to be that somebody, in going back into that wash every morning in the dark, in sitting near a thing that was frightened and feral and had every reason to distrust him, in that patient, daily, unremarkable act, he had given his grief somewhere to go. He hadn't replaced Dutch. He hadn't substituted one love for another. It doesn't work that way, and he would have known better than to try. What he'd done was let something need him again. Let something be there when he woke up and there when he came back. Let something choose him when everything he'd loved had been taken without his consent. And she had chosen him. That's the part I keep coming back to. She was a wild animal with wild animal instincts, and the primary instinct of a hurt wild animal is to get small and stay hidden until the threat passes. She hadn't done that. She'd let him come close. She'd followed him. She'd stayed. He never knew why. He told me that one of the last evenings before I left the Ray's ranch in August of that year to take a position in Taos. We sat on the step of the supply shed, and the night was warm, and the stars were doing their overwhelming work overhead. I've thought about it a lot, he said, why she chose me. I asked him what he'd come to. He was quiet for a moment. I think maybe I smelled like someone who wasn't going to run, he said. Or something like that. I think she could tell I didn't have anything left to be afraid of. He paused. When you've already lost the thing that matters most, your fear changes. It's not gone. It just sits differently, and maybe she could tell. I thought about that. Or maybe, he said, slower, quieter, she just needed someone and I was there. He said it like it might be the simplest explanation. Like the simplest explanations are always the ones that are hardest to sit inside of. I said, maybe both things are true at the same time. He nodded. We sat there for a while with the stars doing what stars do in that country, which is look at you from so far away, and so many of them at once that the looking becomes a kind of pressure, almost kind. I left for Taos a week later. I shook Cord's hand. I kept my ledger. I kept writing things down, as I always have, because my father told me memory is a liar and he was right, and I wanted this particular set of things to be on record somewhere. What I wrote on the night before I left was this. He came here with his grief and with nothing else, and in the canyon country north of the ranch he found something hurt and alone, and he decided to sit near it. The thing got well. He got not well. Better, maybe, less alone, closer to being able to hold what he carries without it being the only thing he carries. She chose him for reasons none of us will ever know. She stayed and then she left, the way things do. He knew it was coming and he prepared for it, and that preparation cost him something, and that something was worth it. I don't know what the lesson is. I'm not sure it has one. I think it might just be what happened. Sometimes a mountain lion chooses a cowboy. Sometimes a cowboy needed to be chosen. Sometimes that's all there is, and it's enough. I heard from Augusto in 1889 that Cord was still on the ranch, that he'd taken over more of the management side, which meant he was working alongside Augusto on decisions rather than just executing them. That he'd built a small addition onto the bunkhouse for his own use, a room with a window that faced north. I heard through a different channel that there was a mountain lion sometimes seen on the North Ridge in winter, a big female, and that she occasionally came down near the ranch and the cattle, but that nothing had ever been taken, no chickens and no calves, and that she seemed to know, in whatever way such things are known, where she was and where she wasn't. I don't know if that was December. I told myself it was, because I am a sentimental man beneath the ledger habit, and because the story works better if it was. But honestly, it doesn't need to be December. It just needs to be a big female mountain lion that knew where she wasn't supposed to go. And the cowboy in the room with the north-facing window, who maybe, some mornings in the dark, looked up at the ridge and thought about a boy named Dutch, and a cub named December, and the particular grace of things that choose you when you've forgotten you're worth choosing.